Hi, this is Twisted Code, and today's story will make your jaw drop. It's a tale about power, arrogance, and the kind of justice that doesn't wait for karma. It delivers it personally. If you've ever seen someone think they're above consequences, this story will make your day. So grab a drink, sit back, and let's dive into the entitled family versus the assistant principal from hell. It began on an ordinary morning. Quiet streets, the sound of a diesel engine rumbling down a suburban road, and a man just doing his job. The bus driver, a gentle middle-aged man named Harold, had been driving the same route for years. Kids liked him. Parents trusted him. He was the kind of man who waved to the mailman and carried extra tissues for kids who forgot theirs. A quiet suburban morning. A rumbling yellow school bus moves down a tree-lined street, its headlights cutting through a pale fog. The air smells faintly of rain and gasoline. Inside, a man hums to himself. Harold, a veteran driver who's ferried generations of kids to school. He knows every stop, every laugh, every routine wave from a parent. But that morning, the air felt heavy. A single, ordinary mistake, a misunderstanding so small it could fit inside a sigh, was about to unleash something feral. And by the time the dust settled, reputations would be ruined, a family humiliated, and justice served cold by a man who'd had enough of entitled chaos. Mark Carver had spent 15 years working in public education, and it had aged him like nothing else could. His old school had been a jungle, fights every week, lockers full of contraband, students suspended faster than new ones enrolled. When he finally transferred to a calmer district, he promised his wife he'd sleep better and smile more. For 8 months, he did. 2 minor incidents all year. That was it. He walked the halls with a coffee cup and the smug satisfaction of someone who'd earned peace. Teachers liked him, students respected him, and his new principal trusted his judgment completely. Every morning he greeted Harold, the school's most dependable driver. Harold was steady as sunrise, gray-haired, patient, the sort of man who waved at kids as if each one were his own grandchild. So when Harold walked into Mark's office one day looking pale and shaken, Mark's stomach dropped before the man even spoke. The day before, Harold had completed his usual route. When he stopped at the white brick house on Aspen Drive, a teenage girl boarded, tall, perfect hair, expression that could curdle milk. Her name was Brittany. She had that particular brand of teenage disdain, the kind that dripped from her like perfume. When Harold reminded her to stay behind the yellow line, she rolled her eyes. "Don't touch me," she hissed when his arm brushed hers accidentally as she stepped off. He opened his mouth to apologize, but she was already typing furiously on her phone. Harold thought nothing of it. Kids had moods. He'd seen worse. He finished the route and went home, tired but content. What he didn't know was that Brittany's text would spark a war. "Brittany, Mom," he shoved her. "He's a creep. Do something." On the other end, her mother froze mid-sip of a kale smoothie. Melissa Davenport, Brittany's mother, wasn't just any suburban mom. She was the kind who turned PTA meetings into power struggles. She wore diamond studs to morning drop-off and treated the neighborhood Facebook page like her throne. Her children, Brittany, her college-aged sister Kelly, and her 22-year-old son Brandon, were her soldiers. Brandon still lived at home, unemployed, built like a linebacker and with the temper of one. When Melissa read her daughter's text, she didn't see a misunderstanding. She saw an opportunity to perform outrage. "Melissa, he what? Who does he think he is?" Brandon smirked from across the kitchen. "You want me to talk to him, Mom?" "Oh, we'll all talk to him," she said, voice like broken glass. That night, she called friends, told anyone who'd listen that a deranged bus driver had assaulted her child. By morning, she'd worked herself into a hurricane. The next day, Harold pulled up to Aspen Drive at 7:04 a.m. like always. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops. But instead of Brittany waiting with her backpack, 3 adults stood at the end of the driveway, Melissa, Brandon, and Kelly. They looked like a firing squad. Harold frowned, opened the doors halfway. Morning. Where's Brittany? Melissa stormed up the steps, her voice shrill. You stay away from my daughter, you filthy. Brandon pushed in behind her. You think you can put your hands on a kid? You'll regret that. Kelly joined, spewing curses that turned a few children's faces red. Inside the bus, 20-odd students froze. Some ducked behind seats. A first grader began to cry softly. Harold raised his hands. Ma'am, you need to get off this bus. There are children. Shut up, Melissa barked. You don't get to talk to me. I'll have your job. I'll have your license. Brandon leaned close enough for Harold to smell the stale beer on his breath. You touch her again, old man, I'll put you in the hospital. The threats poured like acid. For nearly 2 minutes, they screamed, slurs, accusations, wild lies. Then finally, they climbed off, slamming the doors so hard the glass rattled. Harold sat frozen, heart hammering. The bus was silent except for the sniffles of frightened kids. He took a long breath. All right, everyone, he said softly. We're going straight to school. At the school parking lot, Harold didn't even cut the engine before walking straight into the administration building. Mark Carver looked up from his desk as the door banged open. Harold's voice shook. You need to see the bus footage. Now. Mark's stomach turned. Bus cameras were standard, 4 HD lenses with audio. They'd been installed after a lawsuit years ago. Within minutes, the footage was loaded. Mark, the principal, and the school resource officer, Officer Lewis, watched in silence as the scene unfolded on screen. Every insult, every threat, every slur, crystal clear. When it ended, Mark leaned back slowly, his face calm but his eyes cold. Get me their names, he said. Officer Lewis didn't need to be told twice. By noon, the police had arrived at the Davenport home. Neighbors peered through curtains as Melissa shrieked in the porch. This is harassment. I'm the victim. But the officers weren't impressed. They had the footage. They had witness statements from half a dozen terrified children. Melissa was tough, still yelling. Brandon, too, his record already dotted with assault and disorderly conduct. Kelly was given a warning and told to stay off school property permanently. At school, Mark made a few quiet calls of his own. He switched Brittany to another bus route, permanently. He revoked the Davenport family's visitor privileges. When Harold tried to thank him, Mark just said, You did your job. Now I'll do mine. Then he went further. He arranged with HR to grant Harold a full month of paid leave. You need a break, he told him. Go fishing. You earned it. That night, Mark sat in his office long after sunset, watching the empty parking lot outside. For the first time in months, he felt that old righteous fire again, the one that burned when people thought they could intimidate his staff. The following weeks were a blur of paperwork, statements, and meetings. The county lawyer representing the bus driver gathered evidence, video recordings, audio transcripts, student testimonies. The case was airtight. Meanwhile, Melissa went online. On Facebook, she called the school corrupt, accused Harold of assault, and claimed the police were covering for their own. It backfired spectacularly. Parents she'd once manipulated turned on her. Screenshots of the video leaked privately among PTA members. Mark stayed silent. The principal asked if they should respond publicly. No, Mark said. Let her bury herself. When the trial date arrived 6 weeks later, everyone knew how it would end, just not how hard it would hit. The courthouse smelled of dust and anxiety. Harold sat at the front, shoulders square. Mark, the principal, and Officer Lewis sat a few rows back, silent witnesses. Melissa entered wearing a designer blazer, her chin high. Brandon followed, jaw tight, eyes darting. Her lawyer whispered something. She smirked. The prosecution spoke first, clear, concise. They described the trespassing, verbal assault, the intimidation of minors. They submitted the footage. Melissa's lawyer tried to argue emotional distress and maternal instinct. The judge's eyebrows barely twitched. When Harold was called briefly to confirm his identity, Melissa couldn't resist. "You ruined my family," she hissed across the room. The judge's gavel slammed. "One more word out of you, and I'll hold you in contempt." Silence followed like a vacuum. After final statements, the judge leaned forward. His voice was measured, each word striking like a gavel whistle. "Mrs. Davenport, you trespassed onto public property, threatened a school employee, and traumatized children. This was not a mistake. It was a calculated act of intimidation." Melissa tried to interrupt, but he raised a hand. 30 days in county jail. Gasps filled the room. Even the defense lawyer froze. Mark closed his eyes, a small smile tugging his mouth. Finally, someone had said the words out loud. But the show wasn't over. The judge flipped the docket. Next case, State versus Brandon Davenport. The bailiff called his name. No response. Again. Silence. The judge frowned. "He was notified of his appearance?" "Yes, Your Honor," said the clerk. "Same address as his mother." The judge sighed. Bench warrant issued. Effective immediately. The courtroom buzzed. Mark glanced at Harold, who looked bewildered. The next morning, Brandon was found hiding at his mother's house, scrolling through TikTok as if nothing had happened. When he finally stood before the judge, his arrogance melted. "You violated your probation," the judge said. "You skipped your trial, and you participated in this incident. I'm sentencing you to 1 year in state prison." Brandon's mouth opened, then closed again. His mother sobbed quietly beside him in orange jail scrubs. It was the kind of irony you couldn't script better if you tried. Back at school, life returned to normal. The story spread quietly among teachers. Parents whispered about the Davenport disaster in parking lots. Brittany transferred schools within a week. Some said the family planned to move states, start over. Others said Melissa was banned from volunteering anywhere near school property again. Harold returned from his paid leave with suntanned cheeks and a relaxed smile. Kids greeted him with handmade cards. "We missed you, Mr. Harold. You're our hero." He chuckled, eyes misty. Mark shook his hand firmly. "Glad to have you back." "Couldn't have done it without you," Harold said. "Justice did it," Mark replied. "I just gave it a push." Behind closed doors, Mark's principal called him a hero. But Mark didn't feel like one. He just enforced something basic: respect. He thought about how many times teachers and staff faced verbal abuse with no consequences. How often people like Melissa screamed their way through life believing rules were for everyone else. That night, Mark sat in his kitchen, sipping coffee while his wife listened. "You sound proud," she said gently. He smiled. "Proud of the system, for once." She chuckled. "You always did like justice served hot." Mark raised an eyebrow. "No," he said softly. "Cold. Always cold." The story of the bus driver revenge case became local legend. It spread across staff meetings, coffee shops, and parent circles. Teachers who'd been shouted at by parents for years told it like a bedtime story, proof that karma was real and that sometimes the good guys do win. Harold kept the thank you cards from his students pinned to the corkboard above his desk. One in crayon read, "Thank you for being brave when grown-ups weren't nice." It meant more than any paycheck. And Mark. He kept the USB copy of that bus footage in his drawer, not out of spite, but as a reminder. Every time a parent tried to intimidate a teacher, he'd glance at it and think, "Careful. I've seen what happens to bullies." Months passed. Melissa served her sentence, returned home, quieter than before. Brandon's prison term stretched on. Brittany's new school never knew the story, at least not at first. But actions echo. One day, Mark received a letter from a bus driver in a neighboring county. "Heard what you did," it said. "Thanks for standing up for us." He smiled, folded it neatly, and tucked it in his drawer beside the footage. The world was loud with injustice. But every now and then, someone managed to turn the volume down. If you asked Mark what he'd learned, he'd tell you this. Power doesn't come from yelling the loudest. It comes from staying calm when the other side loses control. And karma. Karma loves microphones and HD cameras. For Harold, the lesson was gentler. That kindness doesn't make you weak, and doing your job with dignity still matters. For the kids on that bus, it became their first real lesson in justice. A year later, Mark retired. On his last day, Harold handed him a coffee mug that read, "Never underestimate an assistant principal." They laughed. As Mark drove away from the school one final time, he thought back to that morning, the bus doors opening, the shouting, the fear, and then the satisfying quiet that came after justice. He realized something simple. Sometimes revenge doesn't require cruelty. Sometimes it's just the truth, laid bare, with the world watching. And that's enough. If this story made you smile, nod, or clench your fists for justice, remember, every act of entitlement meets its match eventually. Some people call it karma. Mark Carver called it Tuesday. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories where arrogance meets consequence. Because on this channel, justice always finds its way home.